Hello everyone and welcome back. This video is going to be all about common tech stacks or technology stacks. Now first off, what do we mean by a tech stack? A tech stack is simply a list of all technologies needed to build and run an application. That's all there is to it. Now this can be a small list or it can be an absolutely massive list depending on the complexity of the application. Whenever you're talking about a tech stack, you're talking about whatever technology is needed to fully and completely run an application. Now when we're talking about web stacks, that's basically technology stacks that apply to the web. The front-end tech stack is pretty much always the same, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Oftentimes there's additions to this, such as Angular, React, Vue, jQuery, a bunch of different stuff that you could have in your front-end stack, but at their core, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is really all there is to a front-end stack. There's not really much variance there other than, like I said, those frameworks. The backend is where you really start to get a lot more variance and a little bit more options. In a backend stack, you're going to have your server, and that's just the operating system that runs on your server. Usually this is Linux, but it could be any other thing. So, it could be Windows Server, could be Mac OS if you wanted it to. But this is going to be whatever your server is. Then you have your web server, which is the application that serves up web pages, that receives and sends you requests, that kind of thing. Every backend stack has at least one language, sometimes more. That could be like PHP or Python or Popular. In our case, it's going to be JavaScript or Node.js specifically. But those aren't the only languages. You could serve them with the vast majority of programming languages nowadays. You're also going to have a database that stores data in a persistent way. The reason we need a database is because whenever your server stops, like if you refresh it or you lose power or whatever, then all of your variables, all of the data that you've stored is now reset and you're starting from fresh. That's why you need a database to make that data persistent whenever you have to refresh it. And then oftentimes in stacks, you'll see frameworks mentioned. Like I mentioned earlier, Angular and React and things like that. Those are different frameworks. Not every stack's going to have these type of frameworks, but some will. Let's talk about some common web stacks. These are web stacks that are very common, and you'll hear these acronyms all over the place once you start getting into web development. So it's good for you to kind of have at least a basic understanding of what each one is, even if you don't use them. The OG web stack, if you will, the kind of like the most popular back in the day, was the LAMP stack. It's Linux, Apache for the web server, MySQL for the database, and PHP is the language serving them up. So your LAMP stack is very popular. It used to be pretty much all you would find. Nowadays, it's less popular, but there's still tons of LAMP stacks out there. There's tons of companies that still use the basic LAMP stacks. You have Lamr, or LAMR, or however you want to pronounce it. It's the same as the LAMP stack, except instead of PHP, the language they use is Ruby. Oftentimes, this is Ruby on Rails, but not always. Another common one is Wins. You'll see this a lot of time in enterprise, where you have the Windows server is the operating system, IIS is your web server, you have the .NET framework, and they're using Microsoft SQL for the database. Mean is MongoDB for the database, Express is the web server, Angular is a framework, there's a JavaScript framework, and then Node.js is their language. And then the MERN stack is very similar to that. The difference is that it uses React instead of Angular for the framework. And there's a ton more. There are so many more of these things. You could spend all day looking them up and finding about them. So again, these aren't things you need to memorize. They're just something you need to be familiar with and be aware. Like for example, if you go to a job interview, one of the common questions at job interviews is, what's your tech stack? And they might say, oh, well, it's a LAMP, expecting you to know what that means. If you don't know what that means, you're going to sound like you don't know much of anything about web development, because that's such a common acronym and a common term. So you need to kind of know these. Our stack is the Min stack. It's very similar to the MERN and the Mean stacks, except we're not using Angular or React. We're not using those frameworks because that's outside of the scope of this. After you get done with this course, if you want to go out and learn Angular and React, that'd be wonderful, because those are very popular. They're becoming more and more in demand, especially React. React was done by Facebook, and it's a fantastic UI library. But we're not going to learn that. There's a lot more to that than this course can cover. So we're going to stick with the Min stack, which is MongoDB for our database, Express for our web server, and Node.js is going to be our language. And we're going to be running this on Linux. Now, don't worry if you don't have a Linux computer. That's perfectly fine. I'm going to show you how you can set up a Linux virtual machine in the cloud that you can access from any web browser. There's many reasons for this, and we'll get to them when we start setting that up. But the main reason is because I know a lot of you are using university machines or using machines that you don't have admin access to, and you have to have admin to do a lot of the things we're doing. So we're going to get you set up on a virtual machine running in the cloud so that you do have admin and can install whatever you need to install. And one more thing I wanted to share with you. There's a cool website called Stackshare.io that basically shares tech stacks that big companies are using. For example, there's Pinterest, Uber, Airbnb, so on and so forth. I'm not going to be clicking on Pinterest because I despise their practices, but let's look at Airbnb. Let's view their stuff. Let's look at their tech stacks, and let's look at their tools. And you can see here they use a lot more technologies than just the simple ones that we've talked about. But with that in mind, you can see that they use JavaScript, they use Nginx and React and Java and MySQL. So they've got all these different things as part of their stacks. The reason they have so many is because they're an extremely complex company. They're a very tech-savvy company that has a ton of different things going on, so they need all these. We're not going to be nearly this complex in the things we're making. They're using JavaScript. Nginx is going to be their web server. They're using React and Java. I would assume this is some of their backend as well. MySQL is their server. Ruby, they're using that on their backend. Sass is similar to CSS. It's like an extension CSS. They're using Amazon stuff and Redis and Ruby on Rails. Okay, so they are using the Rails framework here. So they've got a ton of different things that they're using. That's just a cool tool you can use to look into different companies and see what stacks they're using. If you're applying for jobs, you may want to come here and find the company that you're applying to and look at their stack and make sure, number one, that you'd be a good fit for it, but also, number two, you can go to that interview showing that you've prepared and said, hey, I know about your stack. Here's how I would fit into there, kind of thing. And that is it. In this video, we talked about different types of tech stacks and what that means, and we also talked about our stack, which is going to be the Min stack, MongoDB, Express, and Node.js. And then we looked at Stackshare.io, a cool tool to let you look at different companies' tech stacks. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to help. Thanks.